Welcome to the Victoria Anarchist Bookfair's week of podcasts featuring local, national, and international activists and authors. Due to the ongoing global pandemic, the Bookfair Collective decided to move their event online again this year. So for the second year in a row, From Embers is teaming up with the Victoria Anarchist Bookfair to release presentations over our podcast platform. Recordings of these voices of resistance were conducted on unceded Indigenous territories across so-called British Columbia and beyond. For more information about the book fair and a full schedule of online events this week, check out victoriaanarchistbookfair.ca, and listeners in the Victoria area are encouraged to visit Camus Books at 2620 Quadra Street or online at camus.ca for anarchist publications and more. And to find out more about our regular anarchist podcast, go to fromembers.libsyn.com or simply search From Embers in your favorite podcast app.
Hello, my name is Kimberly Croswell. I would like to acknowledge my half of this interview is taking place on unceded, occupied Lekwungen territory in what colonial Canada calls Victoria, British Columbia. The other half of this interview, shared with us today by Uri Gordon, is occurring in Leicester, in the East Midlands, which before the Roman conquest was in the territory of the Coraltalvi Coritanian people. Uri Gordon is the author of several books and articles on contemporary anarchism, including Anarchy Alive, Anti-Authoritarian Politics from Practice to Theory, and Prefigurative Politics Between Ethical Practice and Absent Promise. He is co-editor of Anarchists Against the Wall, Direct Action and Solidarity with the Palestinian Popular Struggle, and the Routledge Handbook of Radical Politics. Uri co-founded the Anarchist Studies Network, and his work has been translated into 13 languages. Thank you for joining me today, Uri.
Thank you for inviting me. Very glad to be here.
Uri, I reached out to you to discuss some of the issues surrounding the use of the terms prefiguration, or as it is more commonly referenced, prefigurative politics. Because as of late, the concept has become a rather hot topic in anarchist and anarchist-adjacent academic circles. I wanted to bring this discourse into a more activist context, and I'm seeking your perspective on how the theory and praxis has developed and where you imagine it might evolve. It's been 3 years since your essay, Prefigurative Politics, Between Ethical Practice and Absent Promise, first appeared in the journal Political Studies, with a variation of the text appearing on the CrimethInc website. And I want to learn what kind of responses have you received for your work. But first, I think we should define the terms we are discussing. What do theorists and activists generally mean when they use the term prefiguration and/or prefigurative politics?
Right. So, I guess the purpose of my article was to distinguish and separate between two different things. Let's say between the prefiguration and the politics. Because the term prefigurative politics normally stands for a radical ethos of unity between means and ends. Okay? It's an approach to doing politics, which is chiefly indebted to the anarchist tradition as well as the pacifist tradition, where the struggle against domination is accompanied by the active construction of social alternatives, and people try to organize themselves and act in ways that are coherent with their values and that are coherent with the type of social relations that they try to create. In other words, this is basically the regular anarchist principle of direct action. Okay, so direct action means that if we want certain social relations, we try to create them. We try to live as much as possible in those ways, and we try to organize also our oppositional struggles and campaigns along horizontal and anti-authoritarian lines. What I wanted to highlight in the article is the prefigurative idea itself, which, unlike this kind of means-ends unity that we talked about, and unlike this revolutionary ethics, is a way of imagining time. Now, prefiguration is an idea that is unknowingly drawn from Christian theology where a future radiates backwards on its past, where the present, in a sense, is a figure which looks forward to its fulfillment in the future. The idea of a future radiating on the present is something that I wanted to probe in this piece, because I think it's a peculiar idea. I think it's a problematic idea. And I think that it doesn't really cohere with the way in which anarchists have expressed their emphasis on unity between means and ends, which involves not a prefigurative temporal framing, but a regular sort of generative temporal framing where the present influences the future without prefiguration, without recursive influence from the future on the present. And those I try to show how those are expressed in the anarchist tradition, while also giving the first kind of proper survey of those key utterances from people like Bakunin and Kropotkin and Emma Goldman concerning means ends unity. So I'm really trying to look separately at this temporal dimension of prefiguration and to problematize it. So most of the authors who write about this term prefigurative politics completely ignore this resonance of a way of thinking about time, and they're just focused on the content, right? On this content of means ends unity. But I think that the lack of attention to this echo which is preserved in the kind of literal prefix of the word needed addressing. So it's not that I think that people are actually sort of at the back of their minds having a sort of semi-theological view of their role and so on. But I think it's something to pay attention to how we think about time and how we might be avoiding looking at the future in terms of the consequences of what we're doing, especially now that we're looking into a future where we do not, like 100 years ago, have expectations of an unproblematic revolutionary transformation, but where we're looking into a future where any kind of liberation happens in the context of collapse, of fragmentation, and the decline of industrial civilization. So those are the kind of themes that I try to look at, and I suggest talking about concrete utopia as an alternative to prefigurative politics with the same content, but without that kind of echo of reassurance as if you're fulfilling some kind of preordained historical process, right? And I show in the article how movements like the Diggers, for example, in 17th century England, which were sort of a Christian anarchist group, their leader Winstanley in his writings also kind of does have a sort of Christian theological view of what they're doing, right, as a sort of fulfillment of prophecy and so on. So that kind of thing does exist, and it's also something that's traced in the literature. So I suggest people can look at the article for all this content and sort of see how that's laid out. It's hard to both tell all these details in an interview, but it's available. I hope it's something that people find accessible and interesting.
Yes, I will add a link to the bottom of this show. So could you talk a little bit more about the anarchist theories of means ends?
Sure.
Where does that come into in our history?
I think this is something that is really part of anarchism since we can talk about an identifiable anarchist movement. I mean, the split in the First International between the followers of Marx and those who were influenced by Proudhon and Bakunin, that split between the authoritarian and libertarian sections of the workers' movement occasioned the first and classical expression of means ends unity, and this circular that was created by anarchists who met in Saint-Vallier. It's in Switzerland, in the Jura Mountains around Bern, where the watchmakers there were part of the early kind of supporters of anarchism in the International. And that talks about, that if we seek a classless society, and if we seek a society without borders, without government, if we seek a society where there is liberation and equality, then we cannot do that by means of imposition, and we can't use authoritarian means in order to achieve libertarian ends. And at that time, it wasn't, it was also about just forming workers' parties to take a parliamentary route. And of course, later, this idea of means ends unity was in opposition to the politics of both the Social Democrats and the Bolsheviks. So if we look at Emma Goldman's great memoir, My Disillusionment in Russia, she and Alexander Berkman, along with other anarchists, went over to Russia after the revolution. And she describes both the hardships there and so on, but also, meeting with some of the leaders of the Bolsheviks, and seeing this dictatorship start to take shape. And with the suppression of the Kronstadt rebellion and so on, then she saw that she was right in her predictions. And the afterword to that kind of summarizes this idea that no revolution can be a factor of human liberation unless the means used are of the same spirit and of the same matter as the end that we seek to achieve. And it's actually a rather mundane and simple and not very striking idea of path dependency, right? The road you go depends where you arrive. And the decisions that are made in earlier stages, the kind of structures that are put in place, the kind of politics that are practiced, they shape their own consequences, and they become the ends over time. Means become ends, and this idea that you can use authoritarian means and then the state withers away. Yeah, this is the basic bone of contention between anarchists and authoritarian communists. So this is really kind of the spine of anarchist politics throughout its history. And I think, like I said before, it's basically identical with the idea of direct action as well. Because if we're looking for a society that is beyond political representation, in which human relations are not mediated by artificial, fetishized institutions, whether that's commodities or offices holding authority, then our own way of organizing and the example, both in terms of the example we give and in terms of the concrete beginnings that we create of different social relations that can expand and defend themselves, have to also be unalienated. They have to be unmediated. They have to reject representation and someone acting on behalf of one, and the investment of political power in people by others, right? And that is individuals' divestment of their own political power. So that is kind of the basic consistency and coherence of anarchist politics as we've known it throughout its history.
You anticipated my question about path dependency, and I was interested in understanding how anarchist means ends unity differs from the means ends theorizing of prefigurative politics. This is referring to the idea of collapsing means and ends into a unity so that they mirror one another, as opposed to establishing a means and ends as determining factors in linear time. Mm-hmm. So many prefigurative theorists have claimed that collapsing means and ends situates their practice as anti-consequentialist, in that their model rejects authoritarian values of the ends justifying the means. Is this an accurate definition of anti-consequentialism?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, consequentialism is what writers like Ben Franks associate with Lenin's approach, right? Of what matters is what happens in the end. I want to say, by the way, I mean, I think that on consequentialist grounds as well, we should also reject authoritarian approaches because they don't in fact lead to a classless society. Mm-hmm. Right? So even on consequentialist grounds, it doesn't work. But the ethics is not consequentialist. It's like, in general, how we evaluate things is by their own value in themselves rather than by their instrumental value to other ends. So I think that, yeah, we can collapse means into ends, but we still need to also understand that there are such things as consequences. Even if we don't judge by the consequences, we still know that those consequences are empirically determined by steps taken before them. But the important thing is that the present is not determined backwards by some consequences. Okay, that is what prefiguration to me stands for. Okay, that whatever means ends relationship exists, I want to emphasize that it works towards the future from the present, and to highlight this kind of recursive idea, which I think is problematic. That's the key thing for me there.
So you talk about reassurance as a false reassurance, and that's what recursive thinking brings to people who are looking from the future back to the present.
I think, just a word of background. Okay, so I mean, listeners who are not very familiar with Christianity or Christian theology might just want to be kind of informed of this, that, the basic idea of how Christianity has interpreted the Hebrew Bible has been as a foreshadowing of the gospel. Okay, so the idea is that everything that happens in the Hebrew Bible can be interpreted symbolically as a figure that is fulfilled in the ministry of Jesus and the crucifixion and so on. And that is how classic Christian interpretation of the Hebrew Bible is taking place. Now, the idea that, there is already some predetermined future that is casting its shadows backwards on the past, on its past, okay, comes from this Christian approach. I also found a very interesting article by Reinhard Koselleck, who is a German thinker and writer on history, and he's talking about the disposability of history. And there he talks more about 18th and 19th century people who were thinking that their efforts at social change were being carried on the wave of, modernity and the unfolding of reason, and it's kind of when this idea of making history started to emerge, but he also agrees that was a secularized version of the kind of process of reassurance that exists in Christianity, that we see through all of these kind of millennial sects and revolutionary groups that were informed by Christianity through the medieval and early modern times. And we see, things like in the English Peasant Rebellion, with the diggers that I mentioned before. So I think that's kind of the thread that I was trying to trace, that I associate with this idea of prefiguration. And I think we need to kind of be self-critical about that. But it doesn't really have a lot of bearing on the content of the politics that we do in that sense.
Okay. So in addition to the pitfall of false reassurance, you describe another pitfall, which you call the occurrence of privileging the present, or presentism. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are utterances where, on the one hand, people say, okay, we're not waiting for some revolution to happen. We're trying to construct things with our own hands and try and make things, happen today, and realize as much as possible our own values and our own ways of being, of sociality within our own struggles. But then you kind of have a tendency sometimes to not even want to think about how that might fit into a longer term strategy for change, or how that might fit into a forward looking vision of that looks forward years or decades. And I think that while there is a lot that is valuable about living and doing in the present for the present, in addition to the kind of concrete aims of the campaigns themselves, I think that it's important not to let that also, distract us from facing forward and looking into a future that is very insecure for us as people who promote social transformation. And now that we're looking forward to this kind of protracted, uneven and irreversible collapse of industrial civilization, and seeking opportunities for social change and transformation in that context, which is beginning to unfold around us. I think we can't be entirely focused on the present. I think it's super important to manifest our values in the present, but I don't think that should happen also as a way of kind of avoiding looking at the future. So I'm kind of encouraging people to be bolder in that respect and to face the strategic questions that accompany the kind of picture of the future that we now see.
Let's turn to the alternative that you are positing to prefigurative politics. In your essay, you turn to Ernst Bloch's concept of concrete utopia. What is concrete utopia, and why were you drawn to Bloch's formulation, even though he's a Marxist?
Yeah, I mean, he's a peculiar kind of Marxist because he's a European Marxist of the kind that you find in the Frankfurt School. People like Marcuse, Adorno, people like Erich Fromm. There's people who kind of take a little bit out of Marx and a lot out of Freud and Hegel, arguably, and tend to be quite libertarian in their politics. Bloch, I mean, I'm not really trying to lift the concept from him, because I think that in talking about concrete utopia, he does not talk about practical alternatives being constructed. He does not talk about living social change. He uses that concept to talk about revolutionary struggles that are not very clearly placed. But I think the idea of he talks about utopia not as kind of something unachievable or as blueprints and designs for an alternative society, but about the utopian impulse, the desire for a world that is qualitatively better than ours. Rather than blueprinting those futures, he talks about concrete utopia and trying to bring that into everyday practice. And I think, he would have found much of interest in these anarchist practices had he not been dismissive of them. But I think it's a concept that could become an alternative. It's more of a terminological kind of argument. Like I said, it's not about the content of what goes by this term prefigurative politics. I just don't like this kind of temporal prefiguration resonance there, which I think we don't pay attention to.
Okay. So for me, when I think of Bloch, I think of an idea called anticipatory hope. And it's sort of like thinking into the future and always anticipating something positive could potentially come from actions in the present. Mm-hmm. And you speak about catastrophic or anxious hope in your essay.
I mean, again, these are terms that I borrow from the work of Burge Aberal, who did an ethnography with permaculture activists in Turkey. And, she goes back to Bloch again to say, okay, if we're talking about this idea of the positive utopian function, what you mentioned about anticipatory hope. But then what we anticipate is also, like we said, these scenarios of, climate change, biosystem collapse, conflict, and so on. Then how does that affect our notions of hope? This idea of anxious hope or catastrophic hope. Anxious hope is that, something something good may come out of these efforts. It's never secure. It's always sort of a maybe, but it's there. And the catastrophic hope is that somehow, through and because of some of the dimensions of this collapse, it will open up spaces for alternatives to build themselves. So it's I think, it's again, if we're looking back to Bloch, then it's just to kind of complete that circle of, if we're reformulating what he says about utopia and hope, then taking that and connecting it to the dilemmas that I discuss in this context.
Yeah. So these are examples of what you call radical hope, and what would you consider to be unradical hope?
I don't know. I think unradical hope can be just the hope maybe that a lot of people have in the electoral system to yield them something. I don't know. In general, look, I mean, at most, this is sort of an invitation for people to reflect on their own dispositions towards the future, on their own kind of imaginations, which is sort of a subtle thing that we don't always sort of stop to notice. There aren't like some big political controversies involved here. It's more of giving attention to our inner worlds as people who struggle for social change.
Do you know of any movement practices or projects that could be considered exemplary of generative revolutionary means and ends, or concrete utopic undertakings?
All of them. I mean, I think that in as much as, to any extent that people are practicing anarchic social relations as part of what they're doing in whatever context or project or struggle or campaign, then that's what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. Recently, an anarchist manifesto by Glenn Wallace appeared that situates your writings on prefiguration and concrete utopia as dual pillars in contemporary anarchist thought. Do you agree with this placement? Is there a place for prefigurative politics, or should the movement turn the page instead?
I don't know about this placement. I mean, I'm not sure enough people have read my work to make it anything of that significance. I mean, I really liked Glenn Wallace's manifesto. I thought it was great. He really expresses things very, very clearly and openly and eloquently there. So I really liked Glenn Wallace's Anarchist Manifesto. That's really recommended for people. I mean, of course, I think we should continue with the politics. It's just the prefigurative part that, I'd suggest a change of terminology there, with attention to how we situate ourselves towards the future and what we try not to think about, maybe, through kind of sidestepping that. So, I'd just like to talk about concrete utopia or something like that rather than prefigurative politics, but I hope people might pay attention to kind of these issues that I highlight as a result.
So thank you, Uri, for considering my questions and sharing your thoughts about taking anarchism to new philosophical directions. Just to let everybody know, Uri's work is widely available online. Just do a search for Uri Gordon. That's URI Gordon. And I just wanted to thank you again, Uri, because your work on this subject is an important contribution to the movement, and I'm grateful that you were willing to speak with me today.
Thank you very much, and thanks for listening.